So let's get started. One of the important things about what we're getting at here and the whole application of occupancy models are answering important questions in conservation and ecology. So what are those types of data that we need to answer these questions? So first of all, you have distribution data, right? Distribution is the habitat and range of habitats that a species uses. This is a way of monitoring threats and assessing habitat associations and relationships of a species in terms of identifying critical habitat or looking at their ecological requirements. So this is one of the components that the IUCN Red List uses when they're making their classifications of species threat levels. The other component of that classification system is abundance. So abundance is different in distribution in that we're looking at actual counts of the species and not just where they are. So this is where we're getting into the population size in an area, which would be considered density, and the population size across the metapopulation, which are all the different interacting populations across that whole distribution. And obviously abundance can be related to things like habitat and management and other threats, but those are the two major components that are used in classifying threat levels for endangered species on the IUCN Red List. But other questions that we're interested in that certainly affect those first two parameters are species interactions, things like competition or predator-prey interactions that could be driving the distributions and abundance of species, and even things like diseases and disease ecology and looking at how that affects the abundance, interactions, distributions. And, you know, indirectly, right now, we're all here online. And, you know, I don't know if you've seen on Twitter and Instagram and all these platforms that people are posting tons of wildlife that are outside in normal daylight in these heavy use human areas because all the humans are inside in some of these cases. So there are really interesting questions that we could look at, all mostly driven with the base level of occupancy models. So there are all different types of data that contribute to those multiple tiers. So first we have presence, right? So if you look at the top right photo, you see a couple, I guess those are probably pocket gophers or maybe microtus something. Anyway, we have some rodents in a drawer in a museum collection, right? And so that is the first level in the hierarchy of types of data, presence. We have these individual vouchers. We have a date and a location, hopefully, on the tag. And that's how we can determine that a species was present at a point and time. The next level up is presence absence, right? Whereas we might be able to deduce absence from those museum collections if we have really good field notes where the collector said, okay, we collected these microtus from this area, and we also surveyed this area, but they weren't there, presence and absence data. But in most cases, we don't have those really resolute notes from the museum collections. And so, so it's always important to think about, you know, this hierarchy of, as we go up this hierarchy, we're getting better and better resolution in the data and the things we can do with those data. So the next level up would be repeated presence absence. So this is the data that's required for the occupancy models that we're going to get into today. And so this is a modeling approach that considers that just because you go and survey for an animal or look for it and don't detect it doesn't necessarily mean that it's absolutely absent. And you could have failed to detect it if it was present. So we'll get into those details in a little bit, but this is essentially doing repeated surveys so that you have repeated counts of detection and non-detection or presence and absence of a species across your study area. Other things that we can look at with these types of data, we can look at activity and activity patterns. A big movement now is looking at temporal overlap between species and thinking about how how species interactions might be driving activity patterns. And so we could do things like, conduct surveys with binoculars or set out camera traps, but we might not necessarily be able to get that data from things like museum specimens where an animal is trapped over some 8 to 12 hour period at night, but you don't know when it actually entered the trap. Then, really high up, kind of the gold standard of the best data we can get is abundance and then actually absence. Sorry, not absence, abundance and density. So abundance is a count of animals that we estimate for an area, and density is a count of animals given a known sampling area. So abundance is when you go out and survey, count, estimate, for example, the number of white-tailed deer in an area, but density can only be estimated once you calculate the true area of inference or the effective sampling area that you surveyed, because obviously these animals are moving, and so you need to account for how far they move to estimate density. So there are more advanced models to estimate density, like spatial capture, recapture, and these types of approaches. And then, those are all at the species level and population level. Now, the next tier up would be things like community level parameters. Things like richness, usually a lot of times movements in ecosystem ecology are thinking about, the integrity of an ecological system is driven by species richness. Richness has multiple tiers. You have, crude, species counts. You also have functional richness, phylogenetic diversity, etc. And then we have community dynamics. And community dynamics are, looking at those changes in the community over time. And those can help you infer things like important ecological dynamics, such as, things like extinction debt, where you have species in a fragmented ecosystem and they slowly are lost over time, and you need to try to estimate the effect of fragmentation. But if you survey right at the time of fragmentation, you might not capture the change in the community. Okay, so there's all different types of survey techniques to get at these data. And I'm just going to give you a quick overview of some of those and all the ways we can use these. So sign surveys, visual observations, camera traps, acoustic monitoring, trapping, kind of standard classic live trapping, hair snares, and detection dogs. So these are all the different types of surveys that all, depending on the sampling scheme, can contribute to the data required for an occupancy modeling approach. So sign survey, and so that also follows some essence of a hierarchy. So sign surveys. So this is the easiest, cheapest, non-invasive way to look for animals, right? So we have here on the right a photo of a key largo wood rat nest, and you can see that wood rats build these giant stick nests in middens. And so what you can do is you can go out on foot. Logistically, it's easy, and you just walk around and look for nests. And in this case, we actually painted sticks, different colors, and put them around nests, and that would even give us another level of certainty, not just, okay, the wood rats occur here, okay, this is an active wood rat nest. And so it's very cheap, you know, great for undergrad research projects, master's projects that don't necessarily have a lot of funding, but not all species leave sign. Sign surveys can also be tricky if you're dealing with things like scat, where there can be uncertainty in the identity of the species. But the uses are, you know, you do have presence only data in some cases where you don't have a standardized survey design, or if you're using citizen scientists, iNaturalist data, for example, usually is only presence only level data. But you can have presence absence and the repeated presence absence occupancy data. For example, if we wanted to use the approach here with the wood rats, what we could do is we could leave some of these painted sticks out for a week, go back, see if there are painted sticks on the nest, pull those painted sticks off, put them back in the environment, and go back a week later, and perhaps the painted sticks are on the nest again or not. And that can give us a repeated presence absence survey type data for an occupancy model. Visual observations, again, are pretty cheap, minimally invasive, but they are very, hi, my love. But they can be time consuming, right? Whereas sign surveys, you're just looking for evidence of the species. Visual observations, you know, these are classic with birders, doing point counts and things like that, where you're looking at the species themselves. But the uses obviously get a little higher, where you can collect behavioral data on species, individuals, interactions, and habitat associations, but also you can go out and do surveys or point counts, for example, and collect presence absence data. But you know, you can also use these data if you're doing point counts or transect surveys for distance sampling, which is a whole nother modeling approach to estimate density, and occupancy or capture models if you can identify individuals from these visual observations. Camera traps, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. This is kind of the most popular survey method at the moment. Certainly I use them a lot. Just so everyone knows, I forgot to mention, I am going to share PDFs of all the talks today. So don't feel like you have to frantically write any notes down or anything like that. I will send all of these presentations as PDFs, and you could share and reuse and distribute as you see fit. So camera traps are a little bit more expensive, obviously, than just going out and looking for sign surveys. But they are non-invasive for the most part. Under most circumstances, we don't see the infrared light affecting animals' behavior. Maybe sometimes flash might influence their behavior, but I've yet to see really strong evidence that it's changing their behavior enough to affect our inference in terms of occupancy. But again, the uses of these data, we can collect behavioral data. For example, a big movement is using camera trap data for estimating vigilance rates or feeding rates of things. And they're even pairing them at feeding stations to do things like giving up densities and things like that. Presence absence again. And then of course, since camera traps are out and running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they're actually collecting continuous data, and we can bin that out into repeated survey occasions and then model it with occupancy. Capture, if we can identify individuals based on their patterns from the camera trap photos. And again, richness, because the camera traps are, you know, not selecting a certain species. They more or less capture everything, and depending on how you set them, you can even capture things like the rodents to the right there. Acoustic monitoring, again, this runs along the lines of the camera traps where we're getting a little more expensive, but we are non-invasive and passive sampling. You know, this is great for, you know, here's a handheld unit where you can go out and, you know, just hit random waypoints and collect data, almost like a point count for bats or birds for that matter. But alternatively, a lot of activity data now is coming from these audio mods and cheaper systems where you can just lay out a whole array of these monitoring systems that can be left out for days or weeks. Oh my Lord. Sorry, give me 1 second here. And so we can use these for behavioral data and occupancy data again, and looking at richness, things like identifying individual bat species. Okay, first I just have to share my little picture, my video here. This is Ursula. This is my little teaching assistant. This is my daughter, and she is 10 weeks old yesterday. So she's going to try to cooperate as we keep going through this workshop. And if she gets to be too much, I will call mom in from her work in over in the greenhouse here. Okay. Hi. Let me just grab a little pacifier here. Hi. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. My love, my love. Hi. Yeah. See, we're good. Okay. Okay, so live trapping. Live trapping can run the gamut of being cheap or expensive. Sorry, let me look. I see that people are writing notes in the chat. I'm assuming it's probably just people telling me how cute my daughter is. Anyway, if you do have a question, I can't see the chat while I'm sharing my screen. So if you have an immediate question that you want to ask, please just feel free to unmute yourself and ask it, because I can't see the chat while I'm sharing my screen. Okay, live trapping, you know, is obviously a little bit more invasive depending on how you handle the animals that you're trapping, and it is time and resource consuming, right? You know, you have to, for me, it's a little bit more difficult because you have to wake up super early to track the traps. It's not this passive sampling like with the camera traps. But there are all different types of traps. You can use Sherman live traps, but you know, even just as effectively in some areas, you can use pitfall traps, buried buckets, and there are all different types of trap configurations and arrays that you can use, and you can get all, you know, information on richness and abundance. And then depending on the type of array you use, for example, if you use a big square array, a 10 by 10, something like that, and you're capturing and tagging individuals across your points, you can actually use that data for capture and recapture, and even more useful spatial recapture, where we're modeling not just the detection of individuals, but their movement parameters. Telemetry, again, is expensive, invasive, can be time consuming if you're out there with a you know, VHF Yagi antenna and have to track the individuals, and you need to meet your you know, data requirements, and you did a power analysis and you realize you need several hundred data points of a individual's locations, and that can be tricky, but that's, you know, time consuming but relatively cheap. Whereas nowadays, you know, you see the giant anteater to the right there has a nice big GPS collar on it with a, you know, long-term battery and a pretty hardy harness to keep it on. And so, you know, this gets much higher up, and there are trade-offs to using things like telemetry data versus the non-invasive techniques like the camera traps and acoustic monitoring, assigned surveys, because while you can accumulate for this anteater thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of data locations, you still are only having data from one individual. Whereas you can lay out these camera trap arrays in a proper study design and collect data on many, many individuals to look at habitat associations. But telemetry data is obviously very high resolution for specific individual behavior, movement, and important things that you can't really capture with some of the other survey methods. Things like dispersal of young of the year, for example, or individual survival and known fates. Hey, we're cooperating here. That's great. Hair snares and track plates. Again, these are relatively cheap and easy. And non-invasive. Here's a cool setup from the Woodland Park Zoo, where it looks like they have little like gun brushes or something, and a bait lure, and this wolverine is about to walk through all these gun brushes. It's paired with a camera trap to make sure you can actually see wolverines have a unique patch mark on their chest that you can identify the individuals. Then you're collecting the hair samples from the wolverines. Then you're usually running genetic analyses to identify individuals based on the genetics. And then you can even go higher to looking at, for example, pairing the camera trap data and the genetic data to get really, really high resolution on your number of individuals in an area, their movement, and again, integrate all that into these spatial capture models or integrated population models, more advanced hierarchical models. And so maybe one of these days I'll try to do a workshop on some of those more advanced techniques, especially if this goes over well here. And then kind of, one that I've always been enamored with and would be cool and have 2 dogs that I keep saying I'm going to train to do this are detection dogs, right? So these are, again, expensive, but right now we have collaborators in the Florida Keys that are even using detection dogs to survey for pythons. So this is, again, a non-invasive approach in many ways, but quite time-consuming, requires a lot of resources. And again, one of the issues with this is essentially a very sophisticated sign survey is that if you have dogs trained on multiple different species of scats, you might run the risk of them, finding, for example, a jaguar scat, and you think it's a puma scat, but until you do the genetic analyses, you might not be able to identify those scats with certainty to the species that deposited them. But again, this gives you presence-absence data, occupancy, repeated survey data, where you go out with the dog, you do a scat survey of your study area, your site, you sweep away all the scats that you collect that day, and then you go out a couple weeks later and do a survey again to get those repeated surveys. And then again, richness, you can train dogs to be on multiple different scats, up to, several, even a dozen, I think some dogs have been trained on. So I think the going number is usually 4 to 5, where, everyone loves them for carnivores. So for example, this dog here is with Claudia Wulst in Belize, and he was trained on jaguar, puma, ocelot, margay, so 4 species. So there are obviously other things that we could combine with these approaches to make them more alluring. Here's a little study that Vicky and I published several years ago from data from Costa Rica, where we compared different lures as attractants for ocelots. And so in the top left figure, A, you can see kind of in the distance there's a little circular hanging thing. That's actually just a CD hanging on some fishing line. And so that kind of wiggles in the wind and shimmers. It catches the moonlight. And the ocelots think it's eye shine from a potential prey. So they're attracted to it. They come over, investigate it. We get the camera trap photos, and then they move on once they realize it's nothing. We use in figure C underneath, you can see just in the background of that ocelot, there's a piece of white material with a little blue edging on it. That's a piece of carpet soaked with Calvin Klein Obsession for Men. And so we can see that, using visual attractants and scent attractants can be an effective use of an effective way to accumulate more data. Nowadays, I don't usually promote using scents or lures unless your specific objective is for a very specific target species. You're not interested in the other animals, and or you're dealing with a very, very rare species that you really need to optimize your surveys for that species. And so then in the bottom, in figure D on the bottom right, you can actually see a CD hanging and a sardine can nailed to the tree. That's, an attractant. And so we found that those were actually attractants for nearly everything, even peccaries, turkey vultures, all different types of things come to the sardine cans. And so that just brings us to one more component here, where there are many instances where you're trying to get at richness or carnivore community dynamics, or just look at a broad sweeping biodiversity survey. And so this is an instance where you might want to pair several of these different survey techniques. So for example, this is from a figure from Nichols et al. 2008 with the multi-method occupancy model approach. And so what they have there is a central camera trap, cubby boxes to the north and to the south, and hare snares to the east and to the west. And so they use all of those data to monitor the carnivore communities, and some of those different approaches are optimized for different species. And so choosing which method you use of those several, and there are, I'm sure a couple other different types of methods that you can use. It's all going to depend on your question. I'm sure most of the people in this talk, your questions are driven by the ecology of an animal and learning more about their roles in an ecosystem or their interactions with other species, or conservation and adaptive management. Can we, for the wood rat example, our question was, are wood rats using, is the addition of supplemental nesting structure, benefiting the wood rats or not? Because we're putting a lot of time and effort into restoring nesting structures, but maybe it's something else that's driving their distribution. And so we can use occupancy models to estimate the use of these supplemental nest structures, and then look at other habitat or predator patterns that might be driving their use of those nests, and then inform management for their conservation and recovery. It's also going to depend on your study organism. If your species is rare or common, that's going to affect, if you want to do live trapping. If you have a rare species, live trapping is a way to get very frustrated. And Vicki can tell you all about how frustrated I was, over a decade ago when I conducted live trapping spotted skunk surveys all over the Ozarks of Missouri and never caught a single spotted skunk. But we caught plenty of raccoons and possums and striped skunks, the common species. But I know that Vicki now has graduate students that, even though they're still quite rare and hard to detect, they are having a lot more luck with camera traps because it's the non-invasive approach gives you a broader spatial coverage, gives you 24/7 sampling, and is non-invasive. So that's encouraging. Accessibility is going to influence what study design or method you use. If you have really remote areas, the best thing to do is to make the one hike out to put the camera trap and the hike back, a month or several months later to collect all that data and let the camera trap or the acoustic monitor collect all that data for you. Climate is going to affect a lot of these things. For example, a lot of these camera traps can be really finicky in super cold or very humid, damp weather, like in the tropics. And then obviously budget. And so what the biggest constraint that I find in most of these types of surveys is usually going to be budget and deciding how to spend that in terms of, do we want sampling gear, or do we want people and technicians and the logistical support to collect and manage all that data? And so I find in many cases the latter is ultimately more important than the survey method that you choose in terms of deciding how many camera traps or how many acoustic monitors, things like that. Okay,